Happy Monday, everybody, and thanks for watching Fight for Liberty. We've got a great show for you tonight, and there's so much to talk about, from murders and riots across the country to a possible change in federal marijuana policy, and even a story about a pet alligator. So don't go anywhere, grab a beer, roll a joint, sit back and relax, enjoy the rest of the show, because the fight has just begun.
Shut up and sit down.
Hello and welcome to Fight for Liberty. Let's start out with a deep dive into some legislation floating around Washington about something we all know and most of us love: marijuana. Today we're going to be focusing on the many versions of the strengthening the 10th Amendment through entrusting the States Act, or more commonly known by its acronym, the States Act. The story with this piece of legislation starts on June 7th, 2018, when David Joyce, a Republican from Ohio, introduced the original version of the bill, H.R. 6043. The bill came into the House with 16 co-sponsors and ended up with 45, including favorites of the show like Justin Amash, Thomas Massie, and Tulsi Gabbard. Now, Section 2 gives this bill a bit of context, which is important because the title gives us almost none. It starts off by saying Part G of the Controlled Substance Act is amended. So now we're talking about the part of the Controlled Substance Act that deals with marijuana. This bill attacks the issue of marijuana policy a bit differently than most other attempts. It works to limit the federal overreach on the issue, and it leaves it up to the states. It goes on to address Section 710, the rule regarding the application to marijuana. Here it lists out the goals of the rest of the act. It says that as long as you are in compliance with the state laws, the provisions described in the Controlled Substance Act do not apply to any person relating to the manufacture, production, possession, distribution, dispensation, administration, or delivery of marijuana. It also specifically points out that it applies to any person in compliance with the laws of a federally recognized Indian nation. Then it goes on to list the different parts of the Controlled Substance Act that this bill seeks to nullify. And Section 2 ends with a small piece that I might not mention, but it will become important later, which addresses the definition of marijuana. It adds industrial hemp to the definition within the Controlled Substance Act and within this conversation. Now, Section 3 takes up a lot of paper to add a few exceptions to Section 409 of the Controlled Substance Act, which deals with traffic safety. It says that the penalty described in that section does not apply to any person who possesses with intent to distribute marijuana, as long as they are in compliance with Section 710 above. Now, Section 4 also amends penalties, but this time they're found in Section 418, and they have to do with distribution to someone under the age of 21. It also gives them an exemption as long as they are in compliance with the state law. We then wrap up with Section 5, which hits one of the most important topics regarding marijuana on a day-to-day basis. It deems actions that are in compliance with this act to not be unlawful, not trafficking, and not a basis for forfeiture of property. And then it clarifies that the proceeds from any transaction that is in compliance with this act is not the proceeds of an unlawful transaction. This means that the cops can't harass you, nor can the federal bureaus of the government regarding finances who may try to say that you are making money in an illegitimate way. This opens up the cannabis industry to a whole new level of financial stability, convenience, and customer service. Now, I like this bill as it sits, and I'm actually quite surprised by some of the original co-sponsors, with Matt Gaetz and Ro Khanna. But it did not pass in 2018 and was reintroduced on April 4th, 2019 in both the House and the Senate with new sponsors and new numbers. The Senate version was sponsored by Elizabeth Warren and co-sponsored by 10 senators, exactly half and half Republicans and Democrats, including Michael Bennet, Cory Booker, and Rand Paul. The Senate version hasn't had a single action since the day it was introduced. Now, the House version was introduced by Congressman Earl Blumenauer, and it now has 63 co-sponsors, 25 of whom came with the bill on day one. Now, here's where it gets interesting. None of the members of Congress I mentioned earlier are co-sponsors on this version. No Amash, Gabbard, or Massey. Now, there are two main differences between the 2018 and 2019 versions that might explain this. The lesser of the two being the omission of that change in the definition of marijuana. So in the new version, industrial hemp is not being added to the definition. The big change is the addition of a new Section 5, which creates a study on the effects of marijuana legalization on traffic safety. It puts the study under the control of the Comptroller General and gives you very little description as to what the program might look like, but it does require a report no later than 1 year after the date of enactment, and it does set testing standards and federal initiatives. Now, I'm usually not one for growing the government in any way, or having the government spy on me or calculate what I'm doing, but if it gets marijuana closer to being legalized on a federal level, I would be willing to comply with this study, especially with the high chance this study proves that legalization is actually safe and has no effect on traffic safety. This bill has bounced around subcommittees and is currently sitting in the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security and has not moved since the 15th of May last year. Now, to make the story even more interesting, on July 15th of last year, Justin Amash, having just left the Republican Party, introduced his own version of the bill without the catchy title and also without the traffic safety study. This version, which has also landed in multiple different subcommittees, has 0 co-sponsors as of today. Now, if you ask me, this looks like some petty bullshit. This seems like representatives who do not want to co-sponsor bills based on who sponsored them and when they were introduced, and are not willing to compromise to get the job done. A lot of these members of Congress campaigned on the point of marijuana policy reform, and they are falling short here. Now, while we're on the topic of marijuana policy reform, I want to spotlight an organization out there fighting the good fight. So here's their founder and his call to action.
Hi, my name is Mark Brownstein. I'm the bass player of the Disco Biscuits and the co-founder and co-chair of headcount.org and the Cannabis Voter Project. Do you care about cannabis reform? Do you care about the legalization of marijuana? Then you should care about voting, and you should make sure that your vote is actually heard. Because over the last 6 years, we've seen an incredible amount of change in the landscape around cannabis laws in this country. We have seen cannabis prohibition being toppled at the state level, one state after another, like dominoes. And across the board, all of this change can be traced back directly to the ballot box.
The Cannabis Voter Project has been taking to the streets and social media since 2018, educating citizens and working to reach their goal of 1 million self-identified cannabis voters by the 2020 election. Their website, cannabisvoter.info, has an interactive map that helps you find your representative and view their voting record on cannabis reform. They even have a link right on their homepage for you to register to vote. The CVP stresses the importance of voting and is working hard to better inform and recruit voters as well as help them find their voice in Washington. They were founded by HeadCount, a civic engagement group dedicated to registering new voters using concerts and music festivals to engage younger people. They've registered over 650,000 voters since their founding in 2004 and have over 100 partners and sponsors. They even worked to start the hashtag #ThankYouNextGen to recruit voters during Ariana Grande's Sweetener tour in 2019. I think volunteering for this organization would be the only way I'd go to an Ariana Grande concert, but together they registered over 30,000 new voters across the country. The Cannabis Voter Project has dozens of sponsors and partners, including the National Cannabis Industry Association, Pro Cannabis Media, and Terrapin Care Station, one of the few dispensaries I've actually been to. But their premier sponsor is CannaCraft, a marijuana farm and distribution company located in California with a range of brands and products. The CVP are gaining traction and have been featured in magazines and newspapers like Forbes and Time, as well as more on-brand publications such as High Times and Herb. You can sign up to volunteer and spread the message when large events are back up and running, but until then you can check out the website and social media to stay updated on the fight to make pot legal again. You can also declare yourself a cannabis voter and let your representative know how important legalization is to you. The government is counting on stoners and the counterculture movement to stay out of politics. They need us to stay apathetic to what they're doing. Getting engaged, showing up to the polls, contacting your representatives, or volunteering on the campaigns against them are the only ways to get real cannabis reform in this country. Go to cannabisvoter.info to get involved. And if you want to get involved with other policy changes, campaigns, protests, or charity work, you can go to fightforliberty.com/join. Now, coming up, we'll talk about the news of the week, a coalition in Washington that's working to fight off the socialist wing of the Democratic Party, and much, much more. So don't go away. We'll be back with more Fight for Liberty right after this. Fight for Liberty was based on a principle of helping people. So here are a few channels and companies that I care about. So do me a favor and go check them out.
Shut up and sit down.
Welcome back to Fight for Liberty. As we look through this week in the news, there's a lot to choose from. So I'll do my best to hit some topics you didn't hear about without ignoring the stories that require some discussion. Early this week, the University of California announced that it would end the use of SAT and ACT tests in their admissions process. Now, this change would apply to the entire 10-school system. They had already made these tests optional for this year's applicants given the coronavirus situation, but they're now extending the period again. Lieutenant Governor of California calls these tests extremely flawed and very unfair, saying that enough is enough. This change is expected to create a ripple effect across the higher learning industry and create a system-wide migration away from the use of these tests. In other news, the 84-year-old alligator, rumored to have once belonged to the German dictator Adolf Hitler, passed away in the care of the Moscow Zoo last weekend. This alligator, named Saturn, was rumored to have survived the Berlin Zoo bombing in 1943 and survived in the rubble for almost 3 years before being found by British soldiers and being gifted to Russia. Now, on a more serious note, Charlemagne the God went on a glorious Second Amendment rant on Weekends with Alex Witt while discussing the brutal murder of Ahmaud Arbery back in February. Take a look.
Yeah, my thoughts, man, rest in peace to that brother and condolences to his family. I wish that brother had a gun on him while he was jogging so he could have defended himself against those thugs, those goons, those terrorists. I call them vanilla ISIS. That's what I call them. They hunted him down like he was a deer. And I would also tell all my brothers and sisters out there to go buy yourself a legal firearm and learn how to use it so you can protect yourself and your family. I am 2A all day, and I think when you're a black person in America, owning a legal firearm is a form of self-care. So that's my thoughts on that. I wish that brother had a gun on him while he was jogging so he could have defended himself. I would much rather see him, in prison fighting for his freedom, in jail fighting for his freedom, as opposed to, being in a casket right now.
The media personality and host of the hit morning radio show The Breakfast Club went on to say, "I don't have any faith in the legal system in this country," which is an opinion with growing popularity in America. The fact that Arbery was murdered back in February, and we're just now hearing about it, and only because somebody leaked footage, is exactly why people don't trust the legal system to get justice for everyday Americans, especially not black and brown Americans. And that brings us to our next main story that could not go without discussion. And that is the broad daylight murder of George Floyd. Now, I'm sure you've seen the video by now, probably even a few times, but in case you haven't, here's a recap.
Developments in the death of George Floyd, the unarmed black man in Minneapolis who died in police custody. We're hearing from the paramedics who treated him. And now the mayor says he wants the police officer who pressed his knee to Floyd's neck to be prosecuted. CBS's Jeff Pegues reports tonight from Minneapolis.
The new cell phone video shows the initial arrest. Officers are seen taking George Floyd out of his vehicle. In surveillance video obtained by CBS News, a handcuffed Floyd is walked across the street toward a police car. In the distance, you can see Floyd fall. In this newly circulated video, 3 officers have Floyd pinned on the ground, while another stands over them. You can hear Floyd pleading for air.
Please let me stand. I can't breathe, officer.
The officer who pressed his knee to Floyd's neck has been identified as Derek Chauvin.
Give me, man.
He doesn't let up until the 46-year-old's listless body is put on a stretcher. In a new report, the fire department says medics in the ambulance checked his pulse several times, finding none. He was later pronounced dead at the hospital. Tonight, the other officers involved have been identified as Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kung, and Tu Tao. But Chauvin is under the most scrutiny. Even though the Floyd investigation is ongoing, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey called for Chauvin to be arrested.
Now, these 4 officers have been relieved from active duty, but 2 of them are still working in different departments, and only 1 of them has been arrested so far. This has sparked days of protesting, looting, and rioting in the streets. Multiple police stations across the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul have been overrun by rioters and abandoned by the officers stationed there. This is just one more senseless killing of an unarmed black person in America. On top of Eric Garner, Jamar Clark, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Shanique Proctor, Mike Brown, and so many more. Now Breonna Taylor, and now we have one more in George Floyd, who did not deserve his fate. Dozens of people stood around and watched while Officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on Floyd's neck for minutes, and they did nothing. Now they're rioting and finally turning their anger where it's deserved, towards the police department. But this murder shouldn't have happened to begin with. As Charlemagne said, we must be armed and ready because I have no faith in the justice system. Someone should have been able to defend Floyd in the moment and save his life. And we should be able to defend people against police brutality without having to worry about being added to the list of senseless police murders. We have to stand up and fight against tyranny because we know damn well our elected officials won't. Just look at Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's in hot water this week because her husband tried to use her position as leverage at their marina to put their boat in the water for the long weekend for Memorial Day. Now, this is especially egregious as Governor Whitmer is the reason boating isn't allowed in the state right now. Whitmer has been in the news quite a lot recently, as her state has had some of the loudest and earliest anti-lockdown protests in the country due to her absurdly excessive lockdown protocols, including a strict moratorium on recreational boating. Now, Whitmer says that her husband was just, quote, making a bad attempt at humor, but I'm not buying it. Politicians have long felt like they were above the law, especially the laws that they wrote themselves. And why shouldn't they? Just this week, the Justice Department dropped 3 of the 4 insider trading investigations that I spoke about back in our premiere show. Senators Kelly Loeffler, Dianne Feinstein, and James Inhofe are off the hook after their accusations that they used privileged knowledge of the upcoming coronavirus pandemic to get ahead of the stock market crash were deemed politically motivated. These senators are relishing in their acquittals, saying they did nothing wrong, and that the accusations were nothing more than, quote, fake news. The investigation into Senator Burr, however, is continuing, being served with a warrant to search his phone just a few days ago, and causing him to even step down as the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Burr started off this investigation with a big target on his back due to being one of the loudest proponents against the Stock Act, the bill that made this practice illegal for senators and other members of Congress. Now, I know you may be sitting here thinking, man, America is the worst. But it's an important thing to remember in a time like this that tyranny is a global problem. On Wednesday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the U.S. can no longer consider Hong Kong a free nation, stating, quote, no reasonable person can assert today that Hong Kong remains a high degree of autonomy from China, given facts on the ground. China has moved to push legislation removing the freedoms from Hong Kong little by little, despite the constant protesting that has been going on for over a year. In an interview with Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien discussed the possibility of new sanctions against China and withdrawing the preferential trading status of the island. Take a look.
Let me start with the Hong Kong issue. What is the United States government prepared to do if Beijing goes through with basically this crackdown on Hong Kong and moves Hong Kong away from an open marketplace and an open democracy?
Well, as you know, Chuck, the Communist Party of China promised Great Britain back in 1984 with the Sino-British Declaration that Hong Kong would have a degree of autonomy and would be maintain their way of life through 2047. So now 27 years before that deadline, it looks like with this national security law, they're going to basically take over Hong Kong. And if they do, under the 1992 Hong Kong Policy Act and the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019, Secretary Pompeo would likely be unable to certify that Hong Kong maintains a high degree of autonomy. And if that happens, there will be sanctions that will be imposed on Hong Kong and China. It's hard to see how Hong Kong could remain the Asian financial center that it's become if China takes over.
Corruption and tyranny are rampant around the world. While China breaks a 50-year treaty with Great Britain, the British government collapses itself. While haircuts and birthday parties are illegal, senators are getting away with insider trading. And while people are getting murdered in the streets, the Democratic presidential nominee is checking people's black cards. It is a crazy time in this world, and we deserve better leadership than these people. On that note, I'd like to introduce a new segment to the show, What's Up Washington, where we look at people in the government trying to change this mess from within. Welcome to What's Up Washington. Today we're talking about a group of centrists and fiscally responsible Democrats who have banded together for over 2 decades to try to stop the socialist overtaking of the Democratic Party. This Blue Dog Coalition was founded on February 14, 1995, following the 94 midterm elections, which have been called the Republican Revolution or the Gingrich Revolution. People call it that because Republicans had a net gain of 54 seats in the House of Representatives, enabling Newt's rise to Speaker of the House. They also flipped 8 seats in the Senate in that same election. These blue dogs decided they needed a way to make sure the centrist Democrats had a voice in Washington, and that their constituents could rest assured knowing they were fighting for their best financial interests. Now, the idea of a centrist Democrat has a lot of baggage in today's politics, and for good reason. Even this coalition has made some bad decisions, which we'll talk about in a bit. But they have stayed dedicated to their fiscal intelligence and have seen that idea through, which I respect. Now, you might be wondering, where does the name Blue Dog Democrat come from? There's actually a mix of answers, going back to when the term was first coined by Congressman Pete Guerin, who said it was because they had felt choked blue by the left wing of the party. It's also a direct reference to the term Yellow Dog Democrat, which is used to refer to Southern Democrats who would vote for a yellow dog if it was put up by the Democratic Party, also known as a vote blue no matter who Democrat. But now, a very common explanation used by members of the coalition is a quote, "When dogs are not let into the house, they get cold and turn blue," demonstrating that they feel like the Democratic Party has left them out in the cold with this new leftist mentality. Now, they have joined the anti-establishment leftists a few times to take aim at the Democratic Party itself. Multiple members of the coalition don't even pay their dues to the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, something Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made news for this year for also not doing. Most of them get away with it because they live in key swing districts that the party cannot afford to lose. Their dedication to their principles and middle-of-the-road thinking on a lot of issues has given them a lot of respect in Washington and also made them a key swing vote in a lot of budget deals. It has also made them out to be a sought-out group of mediators and brokers for bipartisan deals in Washington. Now, when we start looking into where they get their money come from, we notice that the largest donors come from the healthcare industry, which is a red flag for a lot of you, but is pretty easily explained away even if you don't like the explanation. Due to the obvious financial repercussions of the proposed public plan with Obamacare, every member of the Blue Dog Coalition opposed it. This opinion is obviously helpful for large health insurance corporations, and therefore the heads of these corporations would want to keep these people in office. They've also taken a very principled stance on another very controversial issue in Washington, and that's war. They have been outspokenly anti-war since their founding, with one member even saying that anti-war groups should put up primary opponents against Democrat members of Congress who don't vote against the war in Iraq. This is a sentiment I wholeheartedly agree with. Also, they hold a majority opinion of pro-guns, mostly due to the majority of their members living in the South. This coalition has not always been on the right side of things, as I mentioned. Some of you might think them being against Obamacare already makes them on the wrong side of one thing, but here are the main issues I have with them. The entire coalition caucused in favor of the changes to the bankruptcy code in late 2007 and early 2008, letting a lot of big banks and corporations off the hook for their shady business practices. They also backed FISA and the Patriot Act, enabling warrantless spying on American citizens by the executive branch. Now, unfortunately, these are probably problems you expected, as the idea of a centrist Democrat is usually tied to the reputation of an authoritarian hack. So it's weird for me to bring them up in a conversation about freedom fighters, right? Well, here's why they still count. They are blatant and open about what they believe in and what they will vote for. They never pretended to be against big corporations or big governments as long as it wasn't a wasted money. These people are fighting for what they believe in and, in a lot of circumstances, what I believe in. Keep the government as small and as cheap as possible and don't waste taxpayer money. For a lot of libertarians, that's the only thing they really have to believe in. Taxation is theft, right? Even with my disagreements, they still deserve a place in the conversation as decent politicians who are standing up for what they think is best for their constituents. This segment going forward will feature a lot of people I don't see eye to eye with, and sometimes on most issues. but they are doing what is best in their eyes, and therefore they have earned my respect. So look up the Blue Dog Coalition and see if your congressman or congresswoman is a member, and if they are part of the group that agrees with you on most of the issues. If you live in upstate New York and Anthony Brindisi is your congressman, then you are represented in this coalition. All in all, just be more informed on who your representatives are. That is the only way for us to have a true representative republic. Not live from Not Washington. This is David Fite with Fight for Liberty. So as we wrap up tonight, I have to touch on something important that happened last weekend, and that is the Libertarian National Convention. Now, we had a shortened version, and it was all online, so we weren't able to cover all of the business that we would have at a normal convention. So Nick Sarwark is still our national chair, and we haven't changed any of the committee, but we were able to get a presidential and vice presidential nominee out of it. Now, there were plenty of hiccups, because I'm sure if you've ever been on a Zoom or a Skype call, you could imagine how a 1,040 person Zoom call might go. But in the end, we ended up with Dr. Jo Jorgensen as our presidential nominee and Spike Cohen as her running mate. Now, if you know anything about these two people, you know that they are basically polar opposites on the spectrum. Jo Jorgensen was the pragmatic nominee. She was the person that a lot of the party officials and establishment supported. She's a fairly safe bet. She was our vice presidential candidate in 1996, and she has had a long history of working with the party, promoting liberty, and just being a reasonable, decent human being. Spike Cohen, on the other hand, had the backing of almost every caucus in the party. Just one was he missing, the pragmatic caucus. So he's basically everything that Jorgensen wasn't supported by and didn't support. And he was pretty much supported by everything but her. So when they ended up on a ticket together, you could think, wow, we have the entire party represented on one ticket. This year is the year that the party comes together and puts the bullshit aside, and we have a strong, unified team running for president together. We didn't get that. Not thus far. What we've gotten is some of the pettiest and most bullshit infighting I have ever seen out of any political party. We spent an entire week arguing about our vice presidential candidate's shirt wearing decisions. It started all based off of his Facebook profile picture, which is him laying in the sand, in the water, at the beach, shirtless. I don't have a problem with it. Most people I know don't have a problem with it. I don't understand why so many people did have a problem with it. He's at the beach. Of course he doesn't have a shirt on. But it wasn't professional enough for a vice presidential candidate. Now, in a move of equal childishness and pettiness, Spike Cohen then went to make his first media appearance as the vice presidential nominee, a video interview on a podcast, completely shirtless. Now this time, he doesn't have the excuse of it being at the beach and it being a reasonable, normal thing. He's literally in a chair at a desk with a mic like this and a webcam, shirtless. This is the kind of shit that gives us the reputation that we have as a joke of a party. Now, I kind of respect Spike's decision in kind of throwing the middle finger up to the pragmatic caucus. But this is not the time to do it. The pragmatic caucus is no longer his enemy, it's his teammates. The primary is over. There is no longer infighting within the party. That is over. There is no point in fighting other members of the Libertarian Party right now. Our fight is against the other parties. Our fight is to win in November. And we're not going to do that by getting little digs and petty bullshit in against our running mates. If we want to ever succeed as a political party, we need to cut the shit. We need to focus on actually winning elections, running good candidates, and proving good points. Bringing the country together in a unified goal of fuck the government sometimes, right, guys? I mean, right now we have riots across the country because of police overreach, police brutality, and the failure in the justice system. Now, there's only one political party that has been campaigning on those issues since 1971, and that's us. But instead of being out there helping organize protests, we're on Facebook arguing about a shirt. Now, that doesn't mean everybody. I have a few friends that are actually partaking in this movement, and I respect them. But for the most part, the party hasn't said a thing, hasn't done a thing. Even the candidates haven't really made any real motion to be helpful in this moment of terrible, terrible turmoil in the country. If I was Spike, I would be in Minneapolis right now, not posing shirtless for a podcast. We need serious leadership in this party. People that care about the country more than the party. People that care about growing the party more than staying in charge of it. And that is something that I haven't seen from really any main leader in the party. None of the candidates. Nobody running for chair. Even the state chairs that I know, most of them are about keeping it organized, keeping it together, keeping their rule of law, the rule of law, making sure meetings are either orderly or the opposite of that, and making sure that they're always fun and they're having a good time, and never actually accomplishing anything. We're a political party. We're not a club. We're not an organization. We are created for the sole purpose of winning elections, so let's get it done. If you want to help with that, if you want to work on a campaign, if you want to fight for liberty, you can go to the website, fightforliberty.com/join. There you can sign up to host events, volunteer on campaigns, phone bank, send out email blasts, letter writing campaigns, just about anything that you could imagine to help fight for either a candidate or a policy that you care about. I'll see you guys Wednesday for Fight for Liberty Live with Brianna Coyle, and we'll have another episode up next Monday. But until then, keep up the fight.